Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
We think the worst form of competition to be in is one where you don't really know you're in that competition. And that was what happened to, say, Encyclopedia Britannica, when you were sitting there worrying terribly about whether other reference books were going to be better than you, and suddenly you're taken apart by something like Wikipedia. Why do we think that? Because when we look at government at the moment, or Western government, we think it's in roughly the same state, in a competition it doesn't quite know it's in. And if I look at the European elections last week, I look at the midterms coming up in America in November, I see the same thing, which I would describe as a version of discordant apathy. And it is where voters are very, very angry, very, very cross with the politics that they have, not just in terms of the approval ratings of politicians. Three most popular politicians at the moment are outside Parliament. It's also to do with the parties. The Conservative Party used to have 3 million members. Now it's got 128,000. If that was a business, it would be out of business. It's also the sense that despite being very angry, very cross, nothing is going to change. No matter what the voters do, no matter what politicians do. That is the kind of prevailing thoughts, actually on both sides of the Atlantic at the moment. It's wrong for a good reason and a bad reason. Good reason is that really, if you look at history, Western government has kept on reinventing itself. It does change. It changes in really dramatic ways. The fact it hasn't really changed much for, we would argue, almost 100 years doesn't mean it's not going to revert to type and start changing again. And the second good reason is technology. If you really think that the wave of changes has gone all the way through the private sector, if you really think those changes are not going to hit the public sector, well then I think you can justifiably say, well look, none of this stuff is going to happen. But we think would be extremely surprising if that did not happen. The bad reason is that actually, yes, this time the West is in a competition to do with values, competition to do with democracy, because now, finally, Asia has an alternative method of government, and Asia, remember, we will argue, at one time was miles ahead of us. And from their perspective, this is coming back, and so that introduces the three revolutions of Western government, which is the reason why we think the West climbed ahead. And here's Adrian.
If you go back to the year 1600, I think only a madman would ever have predicted that Europe would become the dominant power in the world. You might have thought it would be the Ottoman Empire or perhaps India, and you might well have thought it would have been China. In 1600, there were 3 cities in Europe that had populations of more than 300,000 people. That was the population of the Forbidden City alone in Beijing. And many of those 300,000 people were Mandarin civil servants selected from the whole of this huge country by objective, merit-based examinations. It was an extraordinary system of government. And yet, over the next 300 or 400 years, the West pulls relentlessly ahead, essentially because it has 3 great revolutions in government. The first revolution was a public order revolution. It was the revolution that was created by the rise of the nation state. We regard the great symbol, the great philosopher of this revolution, essentially as Thomas Hobbes, the author of Leviathan, because he said that the fundamental thing that the state must do is provide public order. And that is exactly what the nation state does over the next few hundred years. It gets rid of all these warring barons who've been tearing countries apart. It gets rid of wars of religion by saying essentially that the king should decide the religion of his people, creates public order. But it creates public order in a way that doesn't get rid of competition. You have order within states, but competition between states for preeminence, diplomatic preeminence, military preeminence, trading preeminence. So in China, when they invent gunpowder, they use it to create fireworks. We use it to create wars. They may be more civilized than us, but we tended to dominate for the next few hundred years because of that. In China, when they traded with other countries, the emperor got very upset about this, and he basically said to all the people who lived on that rich southern coast in the mid-16th century, you have to move 17 miles inland. We don't want you contaminated by these other people around the world. Europe, by contrast, trades with the rest of the world, creates empires with the rest of the world. All these countries are constantly competing with each other. Spain has its Latin American empire, and of course, Britain has a huge empire all around the world. Order within, competition between countries, external power. That's the first revolution, the public order revolution. The second revolution is the liberal revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This is a revolution that we tend to associate with France or with America, but the country that we find really intriguing in this period is Britain, partly because we're British, partly because Britain was the great global power of the time, it was the America of its time, but partly because what Britain does in this period has extraordinary resonance with the situation of the state today. Between 1815 and 1848, Britain essentially reduces taxation from about £80 million a year to £60 million a year, but it does that at the same time that it makes government smaller, more efficient, more accountable. It's providing schools, it's providing hospitals, it's providing roads, it's providing a sewerage system at a time when the population is actually growing by 50%. How does it pull off this extraordinary miracle? Gladstone said he went round government saving candle ends and cheese pairings for the good of the country. But more importantly, it's by changing the nature of government. Government in the 18th century was essentially a system of sinecures, pensions, rent-seeking for the ruling class, Micklethwait's ancestors. And what it did was to rip out these sinecures and this rent-seeking and say you must compete on the basis of open competition to get jobs in the civil service, that government functions must be utilitarian, they must provide services for the people. So you can focus government, contract the state, but also provide services for the people. That's a great revolution. It makes the state more efficient, more accountable, and more defensive of fundamental individual freedoms. In the late 19th century, however, you get two complaints about this what we call lean government liberalism. One is that it's not compassionate enough. You get Dickens talking about grad grind in hard times. You get John Stuart Mill, the great prophet of libertarianism, saying that actually what does open competition for the civil service mean if some people aren't getting enough education to become part of this competition? At the same time, the British are looking over at Germany and saying, wait a minute, Germany's got an activist state, a state that's building tariffs, a state that's building schools, a state that's building universities, and they're leaping ahead of Britain when it comes to the new technology of engineering and chemicals, the new industries of the time. So there's a push towards a more activist state. And this lays the foundations for what we call our third revolution, which is the rise of the welfare activist state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And just as the first revolution is associated with Hobbes, the third is really driven by Sidney and particularly Beatrice Webb. They have this notion that the state can be compassionate and efficient, that it's better at running a country than the market. They create the Fabian Society, the London School of Economics, the New Statesman, to spread this doctrine of the state. They look at the huge industrial empires being created by Henry Ford in the United States through economies of scale and scope and division of labour, and say we can apply exactly those same methods to the state. So the state begins to grow. You get the Great Depression. In Europe, particularly in Britain, the New Jerusalem created by the Labour government after the Second World War. You get in America the Great Society. Again and again and again, the argument that the state can make a better, more pleasant, more efficient society. And this argument really works in a fairly dramatic way. You get sustained economic growth. You get France celebrating its growth. You get Germany and this sort of miracle economy after the Second World War. You get Harold Macmillan saying you've never had it so good. People whose parents never went to school or only went to school, to elementary school, get free places in universities. You get this huge expansion of the public sector which provides good, stable jobs for a growing population. And then in the 1970s, things begin to go wrong. You get stagflation, so you're spending money but you're not getting much out of it. You get the war on poverty, and it seems that poverty wins. You get violence growing in the inner cities in the United States. In Britain, you have the great question of who rules Britain, because you've got interest groups, particularly trade unions, which keep subverting government and keep grabbing more power for themselves. Inflation, crime, stagnation, and you get a general sense of sort of moral degradation. And I think the worst point in this great moral decline of the 70s took place in a sauna in San Francisco. And it involved two boys who'd just finished their high school education and two elderly men. John was one of those boys, and he's going to tell you what he did with the two men.
It's true. I was on my gap year, as I say, and I was travelling around America. The person I was travelling with is now a general in the British Army, and we went to go and stay with a cousin of his, who was a rich British guy, made a lot of money and escaped taxes and gone to San Francisco. And he persuaded us to go and have a sauna with his friend Milton, and we sat there in the sauna, and Milton asked us questions like, who was Margaret Thatcher? She'd just been elected. He started depicting this slightly strange world where British Rail was going to be privatised, where British Leyland, the big old car company, was going to be broken up, sold off, where monetarism, this weird thing that I didn't really understand, was going to happen. And I sort of sat there amongst the steam and thought, this is completely mad. I'd just come from a boarding school in Yorkshire where we'd had to be taught by candlelight sometimes because of the miners. The man in the case, though, was Milton Friedman. And the world which he depicted, that was a kind of half-revolution back against the world that Adrian depicted. Because Reagan and Thatcher did change some things. They changed the idea that the state should run business. And just like all the other revolutions Adrian's just talked about, these were things from Britain which went all the way around the world. Go to Eastern Europe, go to Latin America. You'll see still the effects of what she did. They also changed the debate. It's very hard now to just stand there and say your answer to something is more government. There might be a case where you can say government helps in this way, but the general philosophy, the sort of things that Lyndon Johnson said, the sort of things that the New Jerusalem was about. Ed Miliband won't say that. Even François Hollande won't go that far. Certainly Barack Obama won't. So they won a kind of debate, but they lost a big chunk of the reality. Margaret Thatcher spent 10 years desperately trying to tame the state. And she did do an amazing thing. She reduced welfare spending from 22.9% of GDP all the way down to 22.2%. The numbers of the state, and it's still true, the one consistent of all our lives is the state has kept on growing and growing and growing. And that has been the reality of the Western state pretty much all the time since the Webs. And it's not just a matter of proportion to GDP, it's regulations. Go to the flat near where George Orwell wrote 1984. Around that, I think there's 32 different security cameras. The state is much more intrusive than any of us, and it's kept on getting more intrusive. And the reason is us, because it's not just the left. The left asks for hospitals and schools. The right asks for prisons, more military spending. And the wave of regulation that we deal with is just as likely to come from the right. It's just as likely to be the Daily Mail saying, something must be done, as it is from The Guardian. And the reason really is us. We are like Augustus Gloop, the boy in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, who just wanted more and more and more. But in the end, like with Augustus, it had to stop, and that's not a bad place to introduce Adrian.
Why do we believe that we're actually at the beginning of a fourth revolution? Many people have argued that we're going to see revolutions in the nature of government and the state in recent years. Bill Clinton had Al Gore running his Reinventing Government Commission. Not that much came of that. But we actually do believe that things are going to change, and indeed things have already started to change. First of all, because the age of more, the age of ever more, has now come to a shuddering end. We've had since 2007 governments borrowing $16 trillion in order to get us out of the hole that was dug in the recession. But I don't think this sort of deficit financing is going to go on for much longer for many reasons. One is that we've got into the habit of running a deficit perpetually. Keynes said that you should run deficits to prevent recessions from turning into depressions. You should do it as a sort of medicine that you only take at a time of illness. We've got into the habit of doing this all the time, and the effect of all this spending has, in many ways, diminished. It's become a medicine that doesn't work anymore. More importantly, we see the population aging. We see the baby boom generation beginning to retire. In Europe, this aging is going to change the structure of the population, so there's going to be a significantly larger old group of people being supported by a significantly smaller, younger group of people. The same will happen in America, not to the same degree, but it will certainly happen. So that's really putting an end in the long term to this perpetual deficit financing. Secondly, I think there are really positive reasons for thinking that the state can improve. Partly that better management can improve dramatically the state. The state in many ways still continues to act as though it lives in the agricultural era. Why is it that we get these huge, long holidays in the summer during which our children forget everything they've learned over the previous year? It's because they're expected to go out and help with the farming, with bringing in the harvest. It's partly that the state lives in the Fordist age of the Industrial Revolution, of huge integrated companies that own absolutely everything they do from top to bottom. The state continues to operate in that way. But just as in the private sector, you've had a revolution based on contracting out, measurements, best practices spreading very quickly. You're going to get that running through the public sector and improving dramatically the performance of the public sector. But most importantly, I think we're going to see an IT revolution. We are seeing an IT revolution which will revolutionize the public sector. If you think back to the 19th century, you had a machine revolution which dramatically improved productivity in the manufacturing sector. Or in the 18th century, it used to be the case that 98% of the population worked on the land. Now 2% of the population work on the land. I think IT is going to do the same for the service sector, radically improve productivity. And if you think about the state is basically a collection of service sectors that can be changed. If you look at education, we can now use distance learning, we can use the internet, we can use all sorts of artificial intelligence to improve the way that we teach, to get excellent first-rate teachers to teach to a much broader audience. You can use sensors, virtual consultations with doctors to make medicine a much less labour-intensive process. Even if you think that the very core of the state, the most labour-intensive thing that the state ever did, which is to fight wars. It's one of the reasons why states first existed. We're now applying to the army drones, satellite technology, robots. I think the US Army now employs 12,000 robots of various sorts. So this internet technology, high technology, artificial intelligence, robots are going to transform this very labour-intensive sector. A lot of people say to us, well, if you do this, if you apply these revolutions, you're going to harm the poor. Well, we say actually the state does a huge amount actually to subsidize the rich through crony capitalism or the very well-off through mortgage subsidies. There's lots of things that you can rip out and take away, just as we did in the 19th century, that don't harm the poor, actually just take resources that we're giving to the rich. People say that this is impossible, it's a fantasy, nobody will ever translate this into practice because politics always resists this sort of change. Look at what happened to Sweden. From 1945 to 1993, the Swedish state got bigger and bigger and bigger. In 1993, it absorbed 67% of GDP. Top tax rates were 98% of the economy. Then, at that time, they suddenly said, actually, we can't go on making government bigger. So they reduced the size of the state. It's now 49% of GDP. They balanced the budget, they looked at their entitlement programs, and they said, actually, we need to change the way we have retirement, we need to link retirement to age and to the aging of the population. So they got their retirement system into balance, and they said, we need to improve productivity in the state sector. So they gave everybody effectively a voucher, so they have a universal voucher system. They allowed private companies to run schools and hospitals. They created a world in which welfare entrepreneurs could transform the public sector. So you can improve the state, you can apply technology to the state which will improve productivity. There are examples of this already happening which are changing the nature of countries. But finally, there is one pressure which is going to change all of this and which gives added urgency to the process, and that is global competition. The West has had the state-making to itself, at least since the time of Hobbes. Now there are new people in the arena.
A place just in the outskirts of Shanghai, Pudong, what we call the China Executive Leadership Academy. And this is a place you approach. It's got sort of barbed wire around the outside. It feels very military. You come up to the main bit, and suddenly it feels as if you're inside a university. It's sort of like Harvard, but Harvard as redesigned by Dr. No. And in the middle, there is a huge red scarlet building, like a desk. And that is the main headquarters. And there's an inkwell, and there are lots of brown dormitories around the outside. And then this fundamentally is a place where the Chinese send their, what the locals call the cadres, to learn about government. And it's for the senior people in China, the people are going to be ambassadors, the people are going to run state-owned companies, people are going to run provinces. And it's not like the party school in Beijing. They go there in order to find out where government works best. And so they get sent out from there. They get sent to Iceland to go and look at pensions. They go to Chile to go and look at what it's doing to social services. They go to Singapore. Why? Partly because they like the authoritarian angle of Singapore, but also because Singapore delivers roughly twice as good services as we have here for half the cost. But the real core of it is it takes government seriously. It pays people at the top of its civil service $2 million a year. It pays teachers more, but gets rid of bad ones. It thinks really hard about how to push itself up different ratings in a way that we haven't even begun to. It is not necessarily a model for everyone, but what is interesting is that China is out there. It is thinking about how to do these things. We are not saying that China in any way is the answer, but what we are saying is that there is a big battle which has just begun about what exactly the state is for. Because that is the question that Hobbes asked, that Mill asked, Webb's asked, Milton Friedman, even Nash Sorno. What is the state for? And that is a question which the West has ignored and which now again we think it must come back to. Not least because now there is a challenge from somewhere else and there is a debate. And democracy, we very, very much hope, triumphs in it.
You've described how people like voting for things like welfare states that make them more comfortable. And yet you've also described, Adrian, particularly, this whole bargain that people thought they had with their governments since the Second World War of health and education and pensions and so on. It's all being ripped up and rewritten. So you come to the question, are people really going to vote for that? And that it gives democracy a bit of a short shelf life, a fragility. Can it actually solve the problems that it creates?
The key in this thing is to be aware of the alternatives and also to be aware of the true history of democracy. There's a great quote from John Adams, one of America's founding fathers, which says, I never saw a democracy that didn't commit suicide. That's only in 1814. And that might seem weird, but from his point of view, democracy was a brief idea that happened in ancient Athens, was killed in 328 BC when the Macedonians defeated the Athenians, and then went, with the great and honourable exception of one or two Swiss cantons, for years and years and years. We have a general presumption in the West that democracy is just inevitable, and yet we're fed up with our democracies. Our view generally is that you clean up democracy, you get rid of the things which are tawdry and stupid about it, and it works better. Democracy on the whole is still the best system, but the difference now is that there is a challenge.
Adrian, you were describing particularly the creation of the welfare state and then how it swelled. And do you think democracy in the West is at a particular point of crisis now?
What we've seen over the last 20 years is democracy looking weaker. So you've had a retreat in the number of democracies over the last decade, and authoritarianism in the Chinese variety looking stronger. So the challenge to our system is greater. How do we deal with that? I think what we have to do is deal with the over-promising, the over-expansion of the welfare state. We have to focus the state much more on what it should do, what it can do, rather than promising too much in order to save liberalism, in order to save democracy. I also think what happened after the financial crisis in Britain is quite interesting, because when Cameron said we're going to have a period of austerity, we're not going to have to pay each other more than we're earning, the voters basically said yes. I think that if you appeal to the best instincts of people, the better angels of their nature, they'll break with this system in the past whereby essentially what we were doing was robbing future generations in order to stuff our own faces.